The wind shear hitting the reinforced polycarbonate of Sergeant Major Elias Thorne's visor sounded less like air and more like sandblasted glass. It was 2:17 local time, December 14, 2025. Outpost Echo 7, perched 17,000 feet above sea level in the Patagonian high-altitude exclusion zone, was a monument to isolation. Thorne moved with the weary precision of a man who had been operating on pure muscle memory for 3 decades. His breath fogged his internal display momentarily, a fleeting ghost in the neon green of his thermal vision. The only visible light sources were the faint, moody amber spill from the core ventilation stacks, creating sharp, elongated shadows that danced and stretched across the snowdrifts like skeletal fingers. The air itself was a thin, crystalline blade. Thorne ran his gloved thumb over the selective fire switch on his 416 Hong Kong dollars, settling it back to semi-automatic. His patrol route was monotonous, perimeter check Alpha 9 to Bravo 2, but the monotony was the point. Routine meant control. As he rounded the dilapidated satellite array dish, a low-frequency hum, too deep for the generators, vibrated against the soles of his boots. He stopped, flattening himself against the icy shell of the bunker wall, tilting his head to confirm the sound wasn't just pressure tinnitus. The air was dead quiet, save for the wind. Then, the hum resonated again, metallic, deep, and utterly alien to the natural soundscape of the mountain. Thorne dropped to a knee, adjusting the gain on his MLOK-mounted thermal scanner. The readout was a sickly purple haze across the frozen landscape. He swept the beam slowly, methodically, focusing on the dark ravine 70 meters downhill, where the mountain dropped away into the permanent glacier field. Nothing but the heat signature of large, sleeping pack animals, native ibex, insulated against the cold. He cycled the thermal mode from ambient heat to deep tissue detection, filtering out surface noise. That's when the first spike appeared. It wasn't a steady bleed of warmth, it was a condensed, intensely focused heat signature, tighter than any human or animal body mass he had ever logged. It pulsed, a brief flicker of brilliant white against the deep purple background, then vanished entirely. Thorne felt a cold dread tighten his chest, colder than the sub-zero air. He moved forward, abandoning the prescribed route. He focused his primary rifle optic on the spot where the signature had flashed, checking the rangefinder, 68.3 meters. He advanced into the deeper shadows where the corrugated iron fencing had been breached years ago by rockfall. Beneath the disturbed snow, there were impressions, not footprints, but long, segmented depressions, shallow but definite. And stuck to the jagged edge of a broken fence strut, glistening faintly under the sliver of reflected moonlight, was a residue. It was thick, iridescent, and seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Biological, but profoundly foreign. It smelled faintly of ozone and metallic decay. Echo 7 Command, this is Delta 1 Actual. Stand by for status update Alpha 9. Thorne keyed his encrypted comms, his voice low and carefully modulated, masking the spike of adrenaline. The outpost was only manned by a skeleton crew. His report would go directly to Major Rourke, who was likely drinking lukewarm coffee and reviewing outdated geological data. Command, I have anomalous thermal activity, transient and highly localized, approximately 3/4 click west-southwest of V-Stack 3. Confirmed physical evidence of passage. Non-indigenous bipedal track profile. Repeat, non-indigenous. He waited for the standard, sluggish reply. Instead, Rourke's voice, usually gravelly and bored, was razor-sharp. Delta 1, confirm classification. Is this a recognized group beta anomaly or something new? Thorne stared at the iridescent residue on the strut. Group beta referred to the terrestrial, though unexplained, animal incursions common in the high zones. Negative, Command. This is not beta. This signature was too dense, too organized. Based on the residual sample and track structure, this is a sea-level observation. Unauthorized entry, potentially biological. Unknown origin. There was a long silence on the channel, heavy and demanding. Thorne knew that sea level wasn't a designation for wildlife, it was the classification reserved for the unacknowledged protocols drafted after the first deep-sea acoustic anomalies of 23. He was signaling contact. The pressure shifted again, this time feeling like an actual physical weight pressing down on the environment, a localized atmospheric displacement. He tightened his grip on the rifle foregrip, his knuckles white against the polymer. Thorne cut the comms without waiting for Rourke's instruction. Protocol be damned, he had to confirm before the weather shifted or the target relocated. He moved silently, utilizing the cover of the gigantic, ice-encrusted boulders that dotted the glacial moraine. The oily residue was now present on the smooth faces of the rocks, smeared thinly, reflecting the scant light into tiny, disturbed rainbows. He followed the trail downhill. The segmented impressions were getting deeper, indicating a heavier load or perhaps a pause in movement. The metallic resonance he heard earlier intensified, now recognizable as a faint, rhythmic, click-hiss-dash, like complex biological machinery cycling air in an extremely low-pressure environment. He reached a point where the trail ceased abruptly. The snow was packed and unbroken directly ahead, but the air here was palpably colder, pulling the heat from his armor almost painfully. He activated his acoustic sensors. The click-hiss was directly overhead, impossibly close. Thorne froze, scanning the sheer rock face towering above him. Nothing. Then, a minuscule deviation in the thermal field, a perfect line of heat bleeding from the rock face, not reflecting off it. The heat source was not on the rock, it was emerging from the deep shadows of an overhang, perfectly camouflaged against the obsidian basalt. The darkness detached itself from the rock. It was a fluid movement, unervingly silent on the acoustic sensors. The KY'LAR stepped into the faint, residual light, revealing the impossible efficiency of its biological design. Thorne's training immediately identified the threat level as catastrophic. The entity was tall, easily 7.5 feet, a silhouette of dreadful elegance. Its skin, reflecting no light, seemed to drink the meager illumination, making it appear as a hole in the visual spectrum. The disproportionately long arms hung loosely, ending in wide, three-digit appendages that looked less like hands and more like grappling tools, already adapted for climbing or crushing. Thorne didn't need the thermal sight to see the eyes now. They were massive, gold bioluminescent orbs, lacking any discernible pupil, staring into the dark. They pulsed with an internal, steady light, cutting through the gloom like twin searchlights. The creature's head was streamlined, devoid of external features, suggesting adaptation to high speeds or pressure variance. The only hint of a mouth was a faint, short vertical line where human lips would be. Thorne sighted down the barrel of the 416 Hong Kong dollars, the red holographic reticle settling dead center mass on the entity's chest plate, if one could call the tightly woven, dark gray biofiber that. The air thickened further, heavy with the scent of ozone and the creature's faint, oily metallic exhalation. 50 feet. That was the distance. A lifetime in combat, a heartbeat in survival. Thorne held his breath, every muscle fiber locked, fighting the involuntary tremors the cold and fear instigated. He kept the reticle steady. The KY'LAR made no sudden move. It simply stood, observing. Its head remained perfectly still, but Thorne felt utterly scrutinized by the glowing gold eyes, which seemed to register every minute detail of his existence, the microscopic condensation on his visor, the minute shift of weight in his boots, the accelerated thump of his heart, visible even through the armor's padding. It wasn't an aggressive stare, it was the patient, surgical observation of a predator deciding whether its quarry was worth the effort, or merely an environmental feature. Thorne knew that initiating fire was a death sentence if this thing had companions. But allowing it to move closer was guaranteed suicide. He couldn't risk the sound of the safety flicking off his weapon. He had to assume the creature's hearing was as acutely adapted as its vision. The only sound was the high, thin whine of the wind passing over the outcrop. The standoff lasted perhaps 20 seconds, but the compression of time made it feel like an endless exposure in the dark, frozen frame of the mountain. Finally, the entity moved. It did not charge or draw a weapon, it simply lowered its extraordinarily long left arm, exposing the 3 articulated digits. It scraped the tip of the central digit across the rock face beside it, a harsh, grating sound that broke the sacred silence. The action was deliberate, almost inquisitive. Then, the KY'LAR tilted its head, a slow, unnatural motion that seemed to test the limits of its skeletal structure. It emitted a sound. Not the mechanical, click-hiss-dash, but something vocal, a deep, resonant tone, below the usual threshold of human conversation, which Thorne felt vibrate in his teeth rather than hear with his ears. It was a single, complex note that carried immense weight, suggesting communication or, perhaps, a deliberate provocation. This was not a mindless beast, this was intelligence looking back. Thorne's training protocols shattered. He had been briefed for evasion, not negotiation. The creature held the note for a second longer, the gold eyes never leaving his own. The standoff had become an overt dialogue, and Thorne was now forced to reply. He realized he could either pull the trigger and potentially alert a larger contingent, or he could stand his ground and attempt to confirm its intentions. The pressure note faded. The entity waited. Thorne tightened his aim, the decision point resting entirely on the slight pressure of his trigger finger. The chill of the high-altitude night solidified around Sergeant Major Thorne, now less a man and more a frozen actuator in the barren landscape. The thermal signature had resolved into the impossible shape, the KY'LAR. It stood impossibly still, only 15 meters away, nestled against a jagged outcropping of obsidian rock that mirrored its own oily, black skin. Thorne's intensely blue eyes, narrowed to slits beneath his scarred brow, fought against the faint bioluminescent glow emanating from the entity's large, terrifying gold irises. He felt the cold shock of genuine, unprecedented threat, the kind that bypassed doctrine and hit the primal fear center. His worn cry precision tactical gear felt suddenly too loud, the very fabric rubbing an abrasive scream against the silence. His customized 416 Hong Kong dollars remained leveled, muzzle slightly dipped, trained on the center mass where a heart, if it possessed one, might reside. Every breath was rationed, a shallow draw of thin, cold air. The atmospheric pressure seemed to drop further, weighted by the alien's presence. This wasn't observation, this was a deliberate, silent study by an organism perfectly evolved for apex predation. The anamorphic lens flare caught the edge of his helmet's infrared patch, a tiny, defiant beacon in the overwhelming darkness. Thorne initiated the silent recall protocol, a triple-tap signal on his wrist-mounted comms, notifying the 2 men inside Echo 7 of a code black, immediate, silent lockdown and weapons hot. The KY'LAR didn't move. Its posture was deceptively relaxed, the disproportionately long arms ending in 3 wickedly clawed digits hung loosely, yet suggesting an impossible kinetic potential. Thorne felt the gaze of those glowing gold irises digging into him, dissecting his gear, his stance, perhaps even his physiology. He knew he couldn't win a speed draw in this environment. The sheer biological adaptation of the alien suggested preternatural reflexes. Thorne used the momentary stalemate to adjust his grip on the 416 Hong Kong dollars, a subtle shift that checked the weapon's readiness without sounding aggressive. He registered the dark gray biofiber uniform the entity wore. It looked less like clothing and more like a second, tightly woven, highly adaptive skin. The streamlined face, devoid of nose or ears, focused all attention onto the small, vertical mouth slit. which remained closed, expressionless. This creature was built for silence and speed. Thorne decided immediate engagement was suicide. He needed the structural protection and the established defensive fields of Echo 7. The question was how to disengage without prompting an immediate, terminal charge. He held the KY'LAR's gaze, forcing an aura of static immovability, a psychological gambit to imply he was as rooted and patient as the alien itself. The air was so thin it tasted metallic, and the cold deepened the silence until it was almost painful. Thorne shifted his weight, ever so slightly, rotating his left heel. The movement was imperceptible to human senses, designed only to change his axis of retreat by 5 degrees, aiming toward the deep shadow cast by the main satellite array structure 50 meters back. He calculated the distance, the necessary cover, and the alien's reaction time, running a dozen failure scenarios in milliseconds. Every single scenario where he broke contact suddenly resulted in instant closure and dismemberment. The 416 Hong Kong dollars was his life insurance, but it was useless if he couldn't fire before the contact threshold was breached. He utilized a technique honed over decades of silent patrols, the ghost drift. Rather than turning, he began to displace his mass backward, using minute muscle contractions and the uneven terrain to facilitate a slow, agonizing slide. The KY'LAR's bioluminescent eyes tracked the movement perfectly, the gold glow not wavering, not once confirming whether this retreat was acceptable or simply amusing. Thorne could feel the sweat freezing under his ballistic plate carrier. This slow-motion retreat was the most dangerous walk of his life, demanding a level of control over his own nervous system he hadn't required since his first close-quarters combat tour. A sudden, sharp sound ripped through the pressurized silence, originating from the northern perimeter, not a threat, but a technical failure. A high-voltage capacitor on the secondary weather station, battered by the sustained high-altitude winds, blew with a crisp, echoing, snap dash. It was minor, inconsequential to the immediate standoff, yet the KY'LAR reacted. The obsidian head tilted perhaps 2 degrees toward the sound, a momentary, infinitesimal shift in focus. That was Thorne's window. He didn't run, running invited the chase. Instead, he dropped his center of gravity sharply, pushing off his rear foot into a controlled, low-profile tactical bound. He covered the first 10 meters not with speed, but with efficiency, utilizing the small depressions and shadows. The 416 Hong Kong dollars remained crossbody, ready to be brought to bear instantly. When the KY'LAR's golden gaze snapped back, Thorne was already 20 meters distant, dissolving into the deeper, more complex shadows near the comms bunker. He risked a rapid glance back. The alien was no longer a silent statue. It was moving, but not running, it flowed. A liquid darkness detaching from the rock face, covering ground with an unnerving, gravity-defying grace that defied the laws of terrestrial kinematics. The adrenaline dump was explosive, overriding the cold and the exhaustion. Thorne was moving at peak physical exertion, his heavy gear now feeling like a lead jacket, but he maintained the ghost drift principle, silent, efficient, not panicking. He navigated the treacherous scree field leading toward the main airlock of Outpost Echo 7. The distance was 40 meters, and he heard nothing behind him. That silence was louder and more terrifying than any footfall. It meant the KY'LAR was either instantly gone, or instantly close. He slapped the control panel on his helmet, activating the thermal overlay on his visor. A hasty check confirmed the horror. The KY'LAR's signature was closing the distance at an inhuman pace, its movement almost a smooth line rather than discrete steps. Its heat signature was anomalous, barely registering, yet present, confirming its biological nature while suggesting a frightening level of internal thermal regulation. Thorne risked a knee-high sprint for the last 15 meters, slamming himself against the reinforced steel bulkhead of the airlock, the impact muffled by his body armor. He brought the muzzle of the customized 416 Hong Kong dollars up, the red dot sight painting the steel door, verifying its presence. Thorne's practiced fingers punched the 6-digit code into the hardened airlock interface, a process that normally took less than 2 seconds, felt like an eternity. The indicator light remained stubbornly red. He realized his internal chronometer was skewed by panic. He had to force focus. He re-entered the code, waiting for the heavy, pressurized thunk of the primary locking mechanism to disengage. As the light flickered amber, signaling readiness, he heard the faint, unsettling scrape of clawed digits against rock directly behind his position, maybe 2 meters away. There was no time to turn, no time to verify the position. He slammed the override palm scanner, the bioread confirming his identity, and the heavy pneumatic system groaned into action, sucking the airlock door inward, creating a brief, chaotic vortex of high-altitude dust. Thorne twisted, maintaining cover from the doorway, bringing the 416 Hong Kong dollars into the high-ready position, sweeping the immediate exterior. The space where the KY'LAR should have been standing 2 meters away was empty. But the door had not fully closed behind him. The entity had vanished into the peripheral shadow, indicating not a retreat, but a highly tactical, invisible shift in position, possibly already inside the outpost's complex perimeter defenses. He powered through the remaining closing sequence, the grinding of the steel door an overwhelming roar after the long silence. The inner door was still locked, requiring a second, separate key card activation. Thorne leaned his weight against the primary door, ensuring the seals engaged fully, then activated the decontamination cycle, a useless procedure but one that bought him 6 seconds before the inner hatch could be accessed. He stripped off his helmet, dropping it silently to the rubber matting, allowing the cold air to hit his face. He checked the magazine on the 416 Hong Kong dollars, confirming a full 30 rounds of tungsten core armor-piercing ammunition. His focus sharpened to a diamond point. The threat was no longer external and theoretical. It was internal and imminent. The outpost, Echo 7, built to withstand atmospheric storms and terrestrial threats, was now a sealed box containing a predator of unknown capability. The thermal monitors, usually sluggish in the cold, suddenly spiked, detecting a fleeting, almost ghost-like heat signature inside the outer perimeter wall cavity. The KY'LAR hadn't waited for the door. It had breached the layered shell of the station structure itself, finding a route Thorne's security models hadn't even conceived of. The service tunnel was meant for logistics carts and emergency egress, not a flat-out sprint carrying 60 pounds of combat load. Thorne's worn cry pants hissed against the static air as he hammered his boots down the ribbed metal floor. Every stride echoed off the low ceiling, amplified by the heavy metallic tang of the recycled air. The emergency lights bathed the scene in a sickly, pulsing red, turning the condensation on the pipes into streaks of blood orange. He had cycled the external airlock, but the dread curdling in his gut confirmed his tactical failure. The KY'LAR hadn't needed the door. It had moved around, through, or simply past, the primary perimeter defenses in the moment Thorne had broken contact. That level of speed was biologically impossible, yet terrifyingly real. He checked his 6, the 416 Hong Kong dollars held high across his chest, the customizable optic useless in the low light, forcing him to rely on the intensity of the infrared patch illuminating the dust motes. There was no direct visual, but he felt the presence, a cold pressure that seemed to compress the oxygen in the tunnel behind him. He understood now, this wasn't a blind chase, it was a predator stalking prey in its natural habitat. The creature wasn't making noise, but the wake of its passage, a faint, oily scent and the almost imperceptible scrape of its heavy biofiber uniform against the junction boxes, told Thorne it was maintaining distance, calculating the opportune moment to strike. He needed the op center. If he could reach the reinforced core, he could lock out the facility and buy enough time to send an SOS, however futile. He reached the transition point, a junction leading to the deep security checkpoint and the bulkheads for sublevel 3. His fingers, stiff with adrenaline, fumbled with the touchpad interface, slamming the sequence to cycle the secondary bulkhead. The heavy steel door groaned, protesting the speed of its deployment as hydraulic pressure built to seal the corridor. It was a standard 30-second cycle, agonizingly slow when something built for unnatural velocity was closing the gap. Thorne pivoted, dropping to one knee, bringing the HK-416's muzzle level. He focused down the tunnel where the light was weakest. Nothing dash. Then, in the extreme periphery, where the red light faded into pure shadow, the reflection of movement. Not a silhouette, but the briefest shimmer of bioluminescence. Two massive, intense gold irises, momentarily catching the red scatter light before instantly vanishing. The distance the KY'LAR had covered since the last contact point was geometrically impossible. It was 300 meters away a moment ago, it was 50 now. Thorne squeezed the trigger, spitting 3 rounds of 5.56 into the darkness where the eyes had been. The rounds hammered against the metal wall, whining away into the vacuum chase behind the plating. The sound was deafening. Just as the heavy thud signaled the final hydraulic seal of the bulkhead, Thorne heard a faint, high-pitched resonance, the sound of claws scraping steel just outside the closing door. He was clear, but only by milliseconds. The KY'LAR had let him close the door, choosing calculated observation over a forced entry. Breathing raggedly, Thorne pushed off the ground, the scent of spent gunpowder mingling sharply with ozone from the door cycling mechanism. He was now in the pressurized internal corridor leading to the main ops hub, a narrow path lined with massive data conduit bundles. He knew this space was a choke point, and if the KY'LAR found a way to bypass the bulkhead, or if it simply cut through the steel, he needed leverage. He reached into his drop pouch, pulling out a specialized seismic flare charge, designed to mimic a structural collapse alert, paired with a miniature-shaped charge detonator. Working quickly, Thorne affixed the charge to a bundle of fiber optic lines near a heavy junction box 10 meters back from the bulkhead. He threaded a nearly invisible monofilament tripwire across the floor plating, connecting it to the charge. It was a desperate, cheap trap. The alien's advanced senses might detect the wire, but the intent was psychological, not necessarily lethal. He needed to buy noise and distraction. He armed the system, the tiny LED flashing green, and continued his retreat. The silence that followed the heavy gunfire was now absolute, broken only by the rasp of his own forced inhalations. The realization crystallized: the creature wasn't panicking or attempting to breach the door instantly. It was mapping his route. It was intelligent. It was patient. Thorne reached the pressurized junction box accessing the Ops Center maintenance stairwell. He had to descend 2 floors quickly. He pressed his back against the cold metal wall where the emergency lighting had failed entirely, plunging a short patch of hallway into pure blackness. He held his breath, forcing his ears to filter the ambient hum of the facility's life support from any external movement. He waited 3 heartbeats, the longest moment of his life. And then he heard it. Not the rhythmic sound of running, or the heavy stomp of an entry team. It was the faintest possible sound of friction, the synthetic, organic fiber of the KY'LAR's uniform sliding against the textured steel of the bulkhead he had just cycled. The creature was checking the door, pressing itself flush against the barrier, assessing its options. A full minute passed. Thorne did not move a muscle. Suddenly, the sound changed. It wasn't friction anymore, it was a precise, swift, click-dash, followed by a rapid suction cup sound, impossibly quiet, moving up the steel plating of the wall behind the door. The KY'LAR wasn't drilling, it was scaling the wall vertically, using the pipe chases and ventilation systems adjacent to the sealed corridor. Thorne understood the immediate, terrifying implication: the primary doors weren't its barrier, they were merely speed bumps. The creature was moving above him, into the ceiling structure. The Ops Center wasn't a haven, it was a target. The Ops Center access hatch was a reinforced vault door, primarily for atmospheric containment but designed to withstand significant kinetic damage. Thorne punched the 5-digit override sequence, the door indicator cycling from amber to green. He slipped inside the cramped airlock chamber, twisting his body to swing the customized 416 Hong Kong dollars into the tight space. He slammed the interior manual override, throwing the heavy-duty deadbolts into place. The final, grinding mechanical sound of the locks engaging offered a temporary, hollow relief. He entered the ops core proper. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the dormant monitoring screens and the pulsing green light of the primary communications console. Thorne moved immediately to the radio stack, peeling off his left glove. His hand shook slightly as he powered up the emergency S-band transmitter, routing the signal through the highly secured, burst frequency channel. He keyed the mic, his voice a low, rough rasp in the quiet room. Zulu Sierra, Zulu Sierra. This is Thorne, Outpost 7 Delta. Repeat, Outpost 7 Delta compromised. Hostile engagement confirmed. Request immediate extraction and armed response. Say again, immediate hostile contact, biological, non-conventional parameters. Do you copy? He held the transmit key for 30 long seconds, the white noise of deep space static the only reply. He tried the secondary frequency, then the tertiary. Silence. The comms were either down facility-wide or the KY'LAR's presence had already achieved electronic silence. Thorne slumped against the reinforced chassis of the main server rack, trying to regain control over his accelerating heart rate. The silence from outside the vault door was heavier, more unnerving than the immediate pursuit had been. If the KY'LAR was purely savage, it would be tearing the door apart or attempting to breach the walls. But the quiet confirmed the creature's strategy, it was letting Thorne cage himself. It had cornered its prey. He reached up, turning on the room's internal environmental monitors. Air pressure nominal. Temperature stable. Everything was textbook. Too textbook. He checked the schematics glowing faintly on a tablet fixed to his wrist. The ops core was secured on 3 sides by heavy blast walls, but the ceiling was merely structural support housing HVAC, wiring, and ductwork, standard facility design, not built for combat. He ran a diagnostic on the ceiling access hatches, confirming they were simple latch mechanisms, not armored. The KY'LAR hadn't entered the ops core through the door because it was planning a vertical ambush. He pulled a spare magazine from his vest, stripping the 5.56 rounds from the carrier and reloading the 416 Hong Kong dollars meticulously, forcing mechanical precision to override psychological terror. His eyes, intensely blue and strained, scanned the ceiling grid above him. The hunter was above. It was only a matter of when, and where, it chose to drop. A faint, scraping noise echoed from the far corner of the ops core. It was the sound of something heavy dragging across the metal structure of the building, not the floor, but the actual skeletal infrastructure above the ceiling panels. It moved slowly, deliberately, not the furious speed from the chase, but a methodical approach. Thorne slowly raised his weapon, pointing the muzzle toward the ceiling. The KY'LAR was exploring the vertical perimeter, testing the structural weakness of the room. A second sound followed, metallic and resonant, the distinct thud of a pipe being used as a handhold, or perhaps, simply being moved aside. The alien wasn't using its brute strength yet, it was leveraging the facility's design flaws. Thorne realized that the KY'LAR was probably not 7.5 feet tall when moving in these tight spaces, it was flattened, utilizing its unnaturally long 3-digit arms for traction and silent propulsion along the horizontal trusses. It was a serpent moving through the veins of the outpost. He took 4 steps back, positioning himself centrally beneath the thickest structural beam, minimizing the angles of attack. He had 2 fragmentation grenades left. One for the inevitable entry point, one for himself, if necessary. The low drag shifted again, closer this time, directly above the central communications panel. The air in the core grew cold, the temperature dropping several degrees as the creature's presence seemed to actively absorb the ambient heat. Thorne raised his 416 Hong Kong dollars, his scarred brow furrowed in grim resolution, waiting for the ceiling panel to buckle. The central operations core was a mausoleum of flickering light, cold steel, and stale, recycled air now laced with the metallic ozone and the faint, sweet musk of the alien. Thorne pressed his back against a console stack marked Cryogenic Maintenance, Do Not Access, while his intense blue eyes rapidly catalogued the space. The ops core was vast, 2 stories high with a skeletal maintenance catwalk circling the upper perimeter, perfect for concealment but providing too many avenues of attack. He had cycled the primary and secondary bulkheads, securing the main entry and the tertiary supply tunnel, but the loud hydraulic shriek of the closing doors only served as a dinner bell. His worn Cry-Precision tactical gear felt heavy, soaked through with sweat that wasn't just heat-induced. Every shadow held the promise of obsidian skin and gold bioluminescence. He knew, intimately, that the 2 sealed doorways were merely speed bumps. The KY'LAR wasn't interested in brute-forcing solid titanium. It was interested in the hunt, and the ops core, with its spiderweb of comms conduits and vertical pipe chases leading up into the station's core infrastructure, was exactly where the creature wanted him. Thorne raised his customized 416 Hong Kong dollars, switching the sighting system to infrared scan. The scope tracked across the high ceiling grids, following the thick umbilical of power and data lines. He saw the disturbed dust motes floating in the faint red emergency lighting, subtle, near-invisible evidence of recent, non-human movement. The KY'LAR wasn't just tracking him laterally, it was moving above him, using the entire volume of the structure. The ventilation stacks, which he had always viewed as merely HVAC, were now revealed as the aliens' preferred highways. Patience. That was the alien's weapon. It had corralled him, sealing off the obvious routes and leaving him to stew in the operational center, waiting for him to make the panicked move required to survive, which would invariably lead him straight into one of its vertical bottlenecks. Thorne tightened his grip on the rifle's foregrip, the scarred brow furrowing further. He wouldn't run up, he wouldn't run down. He had to turn this highly controlled hunting ground into a localized kill zone. He began the methodical process of establishing a short-range perimeter. He pulled out the remaining 4 pressure-fused charges, simple but effective explosive tripwires, and placed them across the 2 main sealed doors, wiring them to his remote detonation unit. This wasn't to kill the KY'LAR, but to provide an audible, localized warning should it decide to break the seal. As he knelt, his ear pressed against the cool deck plating, he heard it, a sound like dry bones skittering across distant metal, impossibly faint, emanating from the central gravity lift shaft 50 meters away. It was a calculated sound, perhaps not meant to be concealed, but to communicate. "I know where you are." He paused his work, breath held, the anamorphic lens flare from the single overhead red beacon stretching across the scratched metal of his helmet. The psychological game was relentless. The KY'LAR was demonstrating complete control over the engagement tempo, leveraging its superior environmental navigation to make Thorne feel static and exposed, even in the most hardened part of the facility. Thorne finally moved to the operations core master panel, a tiered interface built into the main desk. He needed data. Specifically a schematic of the power grid infrastructure above the ceiling tiles. If the creature relied on the upper structure for movement, then that structure needed to be compromised. He worked quickly, his fingers flying across the greasy, outdated keys. A diagram glowed sickly green: primary communications array, high voltage conduit 3 alpha. It was a thick bundle of armored fiber and power cable running directly across the central axis of the room, perfectly spanning the distance between the two main access ducts the alien had been using. It was a structural weakness disguised as infrastructure. He saw his opening. If he could detonate a localized charge on that conduit, the resulting overpressure and electrical discharge would rupture the surrounding ceiling framework and potentially disable the creature's temporary vertical pathways. It would be a messy, risky move, but it would force the KY'LAR down onto his level, into a predefined kill zone. Retrieving his remaining block of C4 and 2 electrical detonators, Thorne moved to the eastern wall, locating the thickest access panel leading to the ceiling plenum. Using his specialized utility knife, he quickly but carefully unscrewed the maintenance hatch. The air that rushed out was cold and carried the distinct, faintly sulfurous odor of the biofiber uniform he'd encountered earlier. He pulled himself up onto the thin ledge, the weight of his heavily customized rifle pressing against the metal, threatening a giveaway squeak. He moved like smoke, hugging the pipe chases, navigating the narrow space above the ceiling panels until he reached the enormous, shielded conduit 3 Alpha. It was vibrating slightly, humming with latent electrical power. This was not a small explosive job, he needed sheer, concussive force. He molded the plastic explosive around the cable, ensuring maximum contact, then carefully set the detonators to a short, pressure-sensitive fuse wired to his remote trigger. This was the trap. If the creature tried to use this path, or was lured close enough, the explosion would be catastrophic to the immediate environment. Securing the charge, Thorne retreated silently, slipping back down into the ops core, taking up a fortified position behind the central, reinforced mainframe rack that provided the only solid cover in the large room. He was now fully committed to the close-quarters fight. His heart hammered a desperate rhythm against his ribs, but his focus was absolute. He checked the 416 Hong Kong dollars, 30 rounds of armor-piercing fragmentation ready. He activated the infrared patch on his helmet, a small, futile gesture of signaling readiness. He stared up at the point of detonation, waiting. The ops core had fallen into unnatural silence, the buzzing of the electronics masked by the expectant pressure. He allowed himself to wonder if the creature was watching him rig the explosives, analyzing the blast radius, anticipating the timing. The KY'LAR had not reacted to the drilling or the sounds of movement above. It was calculating, letting Thorne exhaust his resources and energy while it maintained its vertical advantage. The waiting was the hardest part, forcing him to confront the grim reality. He was offering himself as bait, praying the creature's predatory arrogance would override its intelligence. The quiet shattered. It wasn't the roar of an entry, but a singular, controlled crunch from the ventilation stack flanking the western wall. The sound of metal giving way to superior biological force. Thorne's blue eyes locked onto the point of penetration. Then, the sound of tearing composite. Slowly, deliberately, a dark section of the grating bent inwards. A narrow, unsettling gap appeared. Through the gap, a sliver of bioluminescent gold appeared, a single, massive iris observing the room below, its light almost extinguished by the heavy shadow of the plating. It wasn't attacking, merely confirming Thorne's position, confirming that he was static. The pressure was unbearable, a physical weight settling on his chest. Then, movement. Not a pounce, but a graceful, sickening extension. A section of the ceiling tile directly below the conduit where Thorne had placed his C4 began to buckle inward. Slowly pushed by an unseen pressure from above. The KY'LAR was checking the structural integrity, moving toward the trap without apparent concern. Thorne raised the 416 Hong Kong dollars, his thumb resting lightly on the remote detonator. The creature was coming to him. The small, illuminated green clock on the M30 digital initiator glowed, a cold counterpoint to the sweltering heat radiating off the central processing unit. Thorne pressed his gloved thumb onto the rubberized firing button, but did not depress it. He held the moment suspended, eyes intense blue in the gloom, focusing his gaze past the worn rails segment of his 416 Hong Kong dollars, fixed on the thick, armored conduit 30 meters away, where the plastic explosives hugged the primary junction box like dark parasitic growths. He could feel the low, resonant vibration of the facility's failing life support systems beneath his boots, a sound the KY'LAR had likely used to map every inch of the complex. The explosion wasn't meant to kill the alien, it was meant to shatter its control over the environment. It was bait, a flash of pain to draw the predator from the high, dark hunting perches of the ventilation shafts. Thorne cycled his breath 3 times, a slow, controlled inhale, a deliberate, hard exhale, the fundamental rhythm of combat mindfulness. He tasted the dust kicked up by the failing air recirculation fans. He had only seconds left before the pressure of the waiting would overwhelm the precision of the planning. The moment felt like the tightening of a wire cable, stretched taut between the present moment and the inevitable consequence. He shifted his weight, ensuring the weapon was nested perfectly against his shoulder. He closed his eyes momentarily, then snapped them open. The time for static defense was over. It was time to invite the war inside the core. His thumb mashed down, driving the contact plate deep into the initiator's housing. A blinding, white flash eclipsed the oppressive amber emergency lighting. The blast was less of a traditional explosion and more of a brutal, focused energy discharge. The C4 charges, strategically placed against the primary junction box, succeeded in vaporizing the reinforced conduit housing while simultaneously shorting the main power grid controlling the core's vertical access lifts. The sound was a massive, sustained crackthom dash, instantly followed by the deep, grinding shriek of stressed metal. Secondary explosions followed as pressurized hydraulic fluid lines ruptured and ignited, sending curtains of oily orange fire briefly flickering across the upper mezzanine levels. The entire core shuddered violently, throwing Thorne hard against the concrete observation pillar. Dust and pulverized insulation rained down. Then came the electrical chaos, the air immediately filled with the sharp, acidic tang of ozone as massive blue-white arcs jumped erratically from severed cables, welding themselves to the surrounding infrastructure. The lights died completely, replaced by the flickering, stuttering crimson glow of the deep-cycle battery backups. The core was now a cavern of broken shadows and violent noise, exactly as Thorne had planned. The disruption was total, absolute. The steady hum of the facility was gone, replaced by the panicked groans of instability. Thorne quickly pushed himself off the pillar, fighting the ringing distortion in his ears, knowing the cacophony was KY'LAR's cue. KY'LAR was traversing the narrow service shaft 4 levels above the core when the structural integrity of the facility violently changed. The alien had been moving with meticulous, silent patience, treating the outpost like a complex, slow-moving organism whose pulse it was studying. The shockwave hit its sensitive dermal layer like a physical blow, an unbearable sensory overload. The immediate cessation of the core's steady power frequency was a biological irritant. This was not the measured surrender it had anticipated. This was defiance, an act of intentional, localized self-mutilation by the prey. For the first time since the hunt began, the gold bioluminescent irises of the KY'LAR narrowed to fierce vertical slits. Its entire posture shifted from liquid stealth to rigid, aggressive vectoring. Its disproportionately long arms anchored against the shaft's inner surface, the 3 sharp digits finding purchase in the strained metal seams. The time for observation had ended. The prey had thrown down a gauntlet of chaos, and the KY'LAR was compelled by ancient biological imperative to answer the challenge with immediate, overwhelming violence. It registered the structural shift. The conduit breach was now a funnel, a compromised point leading directly into the prey's current static location. The predator began its rapid descent, an accelerating obsidian blur moving against the grain of the collapsing infrastructure, faster than any human could register. Thorne stumbled towards the newly created breach point, the massive, gaping tear in the wall where the conduit had once been. The air here was thick and hot, smelling of superheated metal and burnt wiring. He could hear the crackle of residual electricity and the disturbing groans of the compromised structural supports above him. This breach was his designated kill zone, narrow, restricted sightlines, and full of debris the alien would have to navigate. He flipped the selector on his heavily customized 416 Hong Kong dollars to semi-automatic, favoring precision over saturation for the initial contact. He used a discarded section of thick, fire-resistant shielding as a makeshift barrier, pressing his body tight against the cold concrete. His helmet-mounted infrared patch registered the residual heat signature of the explosion, but nothing biological yet. Yet, he felt the KY'LAR's approach like a pressure drop in the atmosphere. The vibration wasn't beneath his feet anymore, it was high up, rattling the unstable ceiling plating, a rapid, rhythmic percussion of contact and deflection. The sound was too fast to be human, too heavy to be anything other than the accelerating alien. Thorne ripped two small, flat rectangular plates, magnetic decoys, from his vest and slapped them onto the metal floor 10 feet to his left, hoping to draw the first glance away from his actual firing position. He settled his breathing back down to the 3-count cycle, intense blue eyes focused unblinkingly on the churning black smoke issuing from the broken conduit mouth. The KY'LAR tore through the last layer of compromised conduit shielding without slowing, using the strength of its long arms to peel back the jagged metal plates like aluminum foil. It emerged into the core proper not with a crash, but with a terrifying, instantaneous fluid movement, transitioning from vertical descent to horizontal assault within a single biological heartbeat. The alien registered the heat signatures of the decoys instantly, but the true threat, the residual scent of chemical propellant and human sweat, pulled its large gold irises to Thorne's position by the pillar. It registered the human form, static and prepared, and the vertical slit of its mouth tightened further. It did not roar or make sound, the violence was purely physical. Before Thorne could register the exact moment of its appearance, the KY'LAR launched itself across the 30-meter expanse of the ruined floor. It was a terrifying spectacle of speed, obsidian skin catching the stroboscopic red light, making the alien appear to flicker in and out of existence as it moved towards the breach zone. Thorne's training overcame the momentary paralysis of pure terror. He saw the movement, he aimed at the center mass and squeezed the trigger. The 5.56 mm rounds impacted the KY'LAR with the sound of snapping bone and tearing biofiber. Thorne fired a tightly controlled 5-round burst, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding, illuminating the alien in stark white light before plunging the scene back into red darkness. The KY'LAR staggered only for an instant, a barely perceptible pause in its terrifying momentum, clearly taking damage but not being stopped. Its biofiber uniform, tightly woven and dark gray, showed small, smoking points of impact, and dark ichor immediately began to seep, steaming faintly in the hot air. The rounds had done enough to disrupt its trajectory, driving it laterally instead of directly into the pillar. Thorne immediately transitioned fire control. Cycling a fragmentation grenade into the HK-416's breach, but the KY'LAR was already closing the distance. It slammed into the fire-resistant barrier Thorne was using, the impact shaking the pillar and driving the soldier back. Thorne knew he couldn't survive a grapple. He dropped the rifle, pulling the pin on a standard M84 stun grenade with his left hand, and drove his right elbow hard into the alien's torso, creating a microsecond of space. The M84 detonated against the concrete floor, a deafening crack that pulsed white light even through the red gloom, accompanied by the violent physical pressure of the blast. The KY'LAR recoiled sharply, the explosive shockwave briefly disrupting its finely tuned sensory organs. This was the window. Thorne didn't wait to assess effectiveness. He snatched the 416 Hong Kong dollars off the ground, pivoted sharply on his heel, and sprinted away from the compromised core and deeper into the secondary maintenance tunnels running parallel to the central structure. He knew the stun was temporary, maybe 3 seconds of disorientation at best. The alien's speed meant any static defense was suicide. He burst through a thin, metal access door, throwing a live magazine onto the floor behind him to create a faint metallic ping intended to mislead the KY'LAR's initial pursuit vector. The narrow, grimy service tunnel was dark, relying only on his helmet-mounted NVG and weapon light, but the tight corners and low ceiling were to his advantage. He had led the Predator into the close-quarters maze, the only environment where human intelligence and planning might overcome sheer biological superiority. He could hear the heavy, rapid thudding of the KY'LAR regaining its footing and beginning the pursuit, the sound echoing ominously down the tunnel walls. The hunt was now a race, and Thorne was running straight toward his next, lethal ambush point. The atmosphere in the operations core wasn't just ruined, it was weaponized. Thorne lay prone behind the reinforced structural rib of a shattered server bank, his makeshift hide, the air thick with ionized dust and the acrid stench of burnt copper and plastoid. His comms were dead, replaced by the deep, resonant groan of the facility's dying infrastructure. The tactical display on his 416 Hong Kong dollars flickered uselessly, reflecting the spasmodic blue-white arcs of shorting power lines above. Thorne didn't need electronics to track the alien now. He felt its approach in the shifting vibrations of the deck plate beneath his chest, a sickening, rhythmic thudding that spoke of extreme velocity coupled with immense physical mass. The C4 blast had ripped out the central vertical trunk conduit, creating a jagged shaft leading directly down from the superstructure, a chute of death. He checked the tension on the fragmentation grenades looped to his vest, adjusted his cheek weld, and watched the shaft through the magnification of his optic. He had traded maneuverability for a brief, perfect kill zone. Anamorphic lens flares caught the light from exposed fiber optics, stretching crimson across the dark metallic surfaces, highlighting the sweat beading on his scarred brow. He heard the sound of ripping metal, not footsteps, but sheer brute force clearing debris, and tightened his grip, the pulse of his blue eyes radiating cold, surgical focus. The KY'LAR didn't drop, it descended like a specialized, biomechanical projectile. The final 20 feet were covered in a blur, the massive form punching clean through a perforated steel grating that acted as a secondary ceiling. The impact was deafening, localized seismic shock that sent shrapnel and dust raining down. Thorne caught the obsidian blur in his sights immediately. The creature was impossibly fast, its streamlined body minimizing air resistance, the bioluminescent gold irises flashing with feral, absolute rage, a terrifying contrast to the oily black skin. Its disproportionately long arms were tucked in tightly, ending in 3 wickedly clawed digits that scythed through the hanging cables and piping like razor wire. The dark gray biofiber uniform offered no tactical distraction, simply adhering to the horrifying musculature beneath. This wasn't the methodical hunter from the previous hours. This was a predator driven insane by its habitat being ruined. It landed 50 feet away, crouching low, emitting a guttural, wet sound through the thin vertical mouth slit, a sound Thorne instinctively categorized as pure, lethal intent. He didn't hesitate. Kill zone activated. Thorne unleashed hell. The 416 Hong Kong dollars roared, its muzzle flash spitting orange fire into the dim, chaotic space. He bracketed his fire, delivering short, controlled bursts aimed specifically at the KY'LAR's center mass and head. The high-velocity 5.56 mm rounds hammered into the alien's chest with tremendous kinetic energy. The sound of impact was sickening, less the tear of flesh and more the wet, dull thud of rounds hitting dense, resilient material. The KY'LAR staggered, a momentary pause that lasted less than a heartbeat, its forward momentum visibly checked, but it did not fall. Dark, viscous fluid, almost the color of motor oil, erupted from shallow entry wounds in its torso and shoulder, but the creature used the brief instability as a springboard. It launched forward, covering half the distance in a single, terrifying bound. Thorne cycled through his magazine, pouring rounds into the advancing threat, his training overriding the sudden, paralyzing fear that adrenaline was feeding him. The recoil was a familiar comfort, but the fact that the barrage hadn't dropped the target was a terrifying revelation. Standard ballistics were failing. The gap closed from 25 feet to 0 in under 3 seconds. Thorne recognized the impossibility of reloading and instantly transitioned. He dropped the 416 Hong Kong dollars, letting it hang by its 2-point sling, and drew his secondary, a compact SIG P320, as the KY'LAR's massive form eclipsed the ambient light. He fired twice point-blank at the creature's head, aiming for the bioluminescent gold eyes, before executing a practiced sidestep honed over 2 decades of close-quarters training. The movement saved his life. The KY'LAR's leading right arm swept through the space where Thorne's head had been, the 3 sickle-like claws tearing a deep, ragged gouge through the reinforced metal of the server rack beside him. The air was pressurized by the speed of the attack, and Thorne felt the rush of displaced heat and wind across his helmet. The P320 shots, even at point-blank range, only seemed to anger the creature further. Its head snapped back, the small vertical mouth slit widening slightly, revealing no teeth, only black, smooth tissue. It pivoted instantly, relying solely on its raw physicality and reach. Thorne was trapped in the kill zone he had created, the fight now a primal, desperate struggle for inches. Thorne knew he couldn't survive a direct hit. He didn't try to block, he exploited the environment. As the KY'LAR lunged again, its focus solely on annihilating the immediate threat, Thorne used the momentum, driving his shoulder into the alien's ribcage just enough to redirect its path by a few crucial degrees. He shoved the creature toward the massive, shattered conduit, the source of the blue-white arcing energy. There was a horrifying, high-pitched sizzle as the oily black skin made contact with the exposed 12,000-volt cable. The electrical charge didn't fry the alien, but it caused a massive, localized convulsion. A flash of blinding blue light erupted, throwing both combatants backward. Thorne slammed into the fractured concrete wall, the impact rattling his teeth and momentarily blanking his vision. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from his lower back, using the dust and smoke generated by the electrical short to cover his movement. The KY'LAR was momentarily paralyzed, twitching violently, steam rising from the contact point where the electricity was boiling the dark fluid on its skin, but the golden eyes were still fixed on Thorne, burning through the static haze. Using the precious 2 seconds of the KY'LAR's incapacitation, Thorne retreated 10 feet behind a pile of twisted structural I-beams. He ripped a fragmentation grenade from his chest rig, pulled the pin with his teeth, and tossed it low toward the alien's feet, bouncing it off a collapsed ventilation duct. The resulting explosion was muffled by the enclosed space but delivered a massive shockwave and a spray of deadly shrapnel. Thorne immediately reacquired his 416 Hong Kong dollars, pulling it tight against his shoulder. He saw the KY'LAR rise, slow but utterly undeterred. The grenade had shredded the lower portions of its biofiber uniform, exposing muscular legs that were slick with dark fluid and riddled with metallic fragments. The KY'LAR's movements were now slightly hesitant, a subtle limp betraying the damage, yet its adaptation was instantaneous. It began to use its long arms to feel its way through the dust, moving with a serpentine grace that defied its bulk. Thorne realized his conventional arsenal had been reduced to delaying tactics. Ballistic trauma was insufficient. He needed to find a vulnerability, a joint, an eye, a breach in the bone structure, and he needed high kinetic energy to reach it. He was wounded, exhausted, and cornered, but the fury in his intense blue eyes matched the creature's own cold rage. Thorne watched the alien's head tilt slightly, a predatory assessment of the shattered landscape. It wasn't hunting anymore, it was exterminating. He reached back and felt the dull, reassuring weight of the combat knife sheathed on his vest, recognizing the grim reality that this fight was escalating toward edged weapons. He leveraged his position, moving laterally along the crumbling perimeter wall, hoping to draw the KY'LAR toward the most structurally compromised section of the operations core, the yawning chasm he had created with the C4. If he couldn't kill it with bullets or electricity, he would kill it with gravity and architecture. The KY'LAR followed, its pace quickening as it sensed the sergeant major's vulnerability. The air pressure in the core began to drop noticeably, a precursor to further catastrophic failure, caused by the C4 blast tearing through sealed sections. This was no longer a tactical retreat, it was a desperate gamble, betting everything on the final, fatal integrity failure of the outpost itself. He dropped to one knee, the 416 Hong Kong dollars tight, and waited for the KY'LAR to commit to the unstable floor plate, ready to fire his last targeted burst. The immediate consequence of Thorne's desperate, last-second maneuver was a deafening symphony of structural failure. The heavy, tilted server rack, ruptured by the HK-416's final burst and Thorne's leveraged kick, slammed against the KY'LAR with the sound of grinding teeth on concrete. An 8-foot sheet of digital data displays, still flickering uselessly, exploded into shards around them. For a fraction of a second, the alien was pinned, its three-clawed digits tearing uselessly at the twisted aluminum frame. Thorne, leveraging the momentary advantage, rolled hard beneath a low beam, the kinetic energy of the impact having knocked the 416 Hong Kong dollars from his grasp. The rifle skittered across the blood-slicked floor, coming to rest near a rapidly spreading puddle of hydraulic fluid. His scarred brow furrowed, sweat stinging his intense blue eyes. He realized the server rack hadn't stopped the creature, it had merely been a momentary speed bump, buying him perhaps 3 seconds. He ripped the combat knife from the sheath on his vest, the heavy steel blade catching a shard of the emergency red lighting. The air pressure shifted violently as another massive section of the ceiling groaned, showering dust and pulverized concrete down onto the battlefield. Thorne didn't wait for the alien to free itself entirely. The stench of ozone and scorched earth was overwhelming, and he knew he had to utilize the environment or die right there. He shifted his weight, low and defensive, his worn cry precision tactical gear coated in gray dust, watching the metallic frame buckle around the alien's terrifying, unnatural strength. The KY'LAR didn't push the rack away, it ripped through it. The sound was like a cannon going off indoors, a violent, tearing shriek of high-tensile metal yielding to impossible organic strength. The alien's obsidian skin, slick with condensation from the rapidly cooling air, shimmered under the emergency lights as it stepped over the wreckage. There was no hesitation, no perceived pain, only the singular focus magnified in the huge, bioluminescent gold irises. Thorne instinctively understood his rifle was useless, likely having sustained internal damage from the fall and the surrounding chaos. He shifted his grip on the knife, blade pointed upward in a reverse ice pick hold, adopting a stance trained into him over 2 decades of close-quarters combat. The KY'LAR closed the 7 feet separating them in a single, silent blur of motion. The first strike was meant to decapitate, a whistling sweep of a disproportionately long arm ending in 3 razor-sharp digits. Thorne dropped his center of gravity, the claws passing mere inches above his helmet's infrared patch. He felt the terrifying wind shear of the movement. He didn't have time to counterattack. The alien was already retracting and launching the opposite arm in a horizontal backsweep designed to crush his ribs. This wasn't combat, it was survival against a living, hyper-optimized machine. The entire ops sector screamed its final death rattle, the rhythmic groaning of strained support columns providing a morbid percussion to the duel. Thorne met the sweeping arm not with evasion, but with calculated aggression. Instead of pulling back, he drove forward into the alien space, aiming the point of his heavy steel knife at the closest point of articulation, the elbow joint. The impact was jarring. It was not the soft give of flesh, but the sickening resistance of hardened chitin or densely packed biological fiber, overlaid by that oily, slick obsidian skin. The knife glanced off, momentarily skipping, but the force of the strike was enough to disrupt the KY'LAR's balance. He saw a flicker of confusion, or perhaps annoyance, in the alien's gold eyes, the first non-aggression emotion he had witnessed. He pressed the advantage, driving his shoulder into the alien's ribcage. It felt like hitting reinforced concrete wrapped in rubber. He heard a soft, wet sound, and smelled a metallic tang distinct from human blood. His blade had finally found purchase, not deep, but enough to shear through the biofiber uniform near the shoulder seam. He saw a bead of fluid, thick and strangely iridescent, well up on the slick black surface. The alien reacted instantly, not with a roar, but with a sudden, powerful guttural expulsion of air, twisting its body and leveraging its immense height. Thorne felt a crushing impact against his lower back as the alien drove its hip into him, slamming him against a remaining structural pillar. The air rushed out of his lungs, blurring his vision momentarily. The pillar saved Thorne from total collapse, but the pain was blinding. He tasted blood. Despite the pain, the sight of the shimmering iridescent fluid on the KY'LAR's shoulder validated his strategy. It could be damaged, but precision and overwhelming force were required. He had neither. He needed distance. He scrabbled at the fragmentation grenades on his vest, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. The KY'LAR was already raising its arms, ready for the killing blow, a downward smash that would end the encounter. Thorne didn't prime the frag. He grabbed the less lethal tool first, a tactical flashbang, designated M84. He yanked the pin and threw it low, targeting the space between the alien's feet, simultaneously pushing off the pillar and running hard toward a narrow, obscured maintenance access hatch 10 meters away. The flashbang detonated with a blinding white flare and a concussive shockwave that echoed violently in the confined space. The KY'LAR shielded its huge eyes instantly, its head tilting back in a reflexive movement that suggested its light sensitivity was extreme, a vulnerability rooted in its biology. The momentary reprieve was precious, but not absolute. Thorne felt the floor plates beneath his worn tactical boots shift seismically as he ran, dodging debris. The image of the alien startled, gold-flaring eyes burned into his retina. He knew the flashbang only bought him 4 seconds, tops. He reached the maintenance hatch just as the KY'LAR recovered, its initial momentary shock replaced by intensified rage. Thorne ripped the handle open, a heavy industrial latch, and dropped into the darkness of the narrow, vertical ventilation shaft without hesitation. He fell 3 feet. Landing hard on slick metal grating, sending an agonizing jolt through his bruised spine. The shaft was intended for cabling and small robotic inspections, barely 3 feet wide and 4 feet high, restricting his movement severely. He pulled the heavy hatch door shut just as the 3 claws of the KY'LAR slammed against the exterior. The metal screeched in protest, buckling inward under the force. Thorne army crawled rapidly down the shaft, navigating rusted braces and sharp metal edges. The darkness here was absolute, forcing him to rely on his helmet-mounted night vision, which cast everything in sickly green hues. Behind him, the sound of the alien tearing open the hatch was inevitable, terrifyingly close. Its size, 7.5 feet tall, should have made this pursuit impossible, but the KY'LAR twisted and compressed its slender body with unnerving efficiency, sliding through the damaged opening and beginning its crawl. The sound of its massive, dense form scraping against the metal walls was the loudest noise Thorne had ever heard in his life. Thorne didn't slow, despite the grinding pain in his back and the lack of oxygen. He reached an intersection, a junction where the ventilation shaft met a larger, derelict coolant conduit. He paused only long enough to check his remaining inventory, 2 fragmentation grenades, 1 smoke canister, and his knife. The 416 Hong Kong dollars was gone. He pressed the short-range comms button on his collar, transmitting a burst on the emergency military channel, knowing it was likely futile but necessary. Command, this is Thorne. Designation Bravo 07. Ops sector compromised. Hostile engagement ongoing. Suggest immediate activation of Core Containment Protocol Delta 9. Repeat, D9. He immediately cut the transmission, listening intently to the scrape and thud of the KY'LAR moving closer through the metal tube. It was fast, terrifyingly so, even restricted. He realized the alien wasn't just blindly chasing him, its path was incredibly direct, bypassing unnecessary turns, aiming for the lowest and deepest parts of the base infrastructure. The KY'LAR wasn't just eliminating a threat, it was targeting the primary fusion generator, the source of the base's polluting power supply. The creature was driven by a single, focused directive: eradication of the environmental hazard. This realization gave Thorne a tactical edge, a way to anticipate the alien's movements and set a necessary, desperate trap. Thorne scrambled into the adjacent, larger coolant conduit, quickly locating a manual release valve marked by faded hazard tape. He gripped his remaining fragmentation grenade, pulling the pin and securing the safety lever with grim determination. He wedged the grenade securely behind the release valve lever, rigging it with a piece of wire torn from the conduit wall. The trap was crude but potentially effective. He moved another 10 feet down the conduit and pressed his body tight against the curved metal wall, listening. The moment the KY'LAR reached the junction, it moved toward the lowest path, exactly as predicted, its obsidian head dipping down to examine the junction. In that instant, Thorne threw a small piece of loose metal grating, hitting the fragile rigged wire. The grenade detonated instantly, not outwardly, but directly against the thick, pressurized coolant valve. The valve sheared off violently, releasing a catastrophic torrent of superheated, high-pressure steam and cryocoolant directly into the narrow corridor where the KY'LAR was moving. The sound was a horrific, ear-splitting shriek. The KY'LAR, bathed momentarily in the blinding white steam, raised its arms in defense, its large gold eyes wide, reflecting not fear, but pure, cold focus on its objective even as its body was violently assaulted by the environmental hazard. Thorne didn't wait to see the outcome. He shoved himself through the coolant conduit and out into a vertical maintenance shaft leading directly to the generator sublevel, reloading his last magazine for the knifeless M9 pistol he carried, the weight of the base's survival now resting entirely on his bruised shoulders. The ventilation shaft was a tight, vibrating coffin. Its metallic scent overlaid with dust and the acrid tang of ozone leaking from strained electrical conduits. Thorne, moving with the economical effort of a predator in its den, crawled forward, his cry gear snagging slightly on rivets. The air handlers above him strained, sounding less like machinery and more like the ragged breathing of a dying organism. He felt the seismic reverberations of the KY'LAR moving below, not merely walking, but impacting, tearing through bulkheads with focused, relentless force. Every vibration confirmed his terrible realization: the KY'LAR was not hunting him primarily, it was executing a scorched earth plan. His 416 Hong Kong dollars, abandoned in the ops sector, was now irrelevant. This was no longer a tactical engagement, it was infrastructural warfare. He pulled himself over a collapsing section of duct, the cheap aluminum groaning, and secured his knife, its blade still slick with the obsidian blood from their brief, desperate close-quarters exchange, back into its sheath on his vest. He needed altitude, a clear line of sight to the central environmental controls, and silence. The faint, high-pitched whine of the alien's biofiber uniform shifting below him was the only persistent sound besides the structural stress, confirming the creature was directly underneath, adapting its hunt to the restricted geometry of the collapsing base. Thorne halted at a cross-junction, pressing his ear against the cold metal flooring of the shaft. The analysis clicked into place with chilling clarity. KY'LAR hadn't targeted the antenna array or the armory first. It had hit the geothermal power regulators in Sector Gamma and the primary atmospheric scrubber in Sector Delta. It wasn't interested in killing the crew or capturing assets, it was ensuring the base became uninhabitable to humans, a toxic scar on the pristine geology it seemed driven to protect. This wasn't military strategy, it was ecological sabotage. Thorne pulled out his last 2 fragmentation grenades, their rough casings feeling heavy and reassuring in his palm. If the creature sought to destroy the environmental infrastructure, that same infrastructure would have to be his weapon. He located the schematic overlay on his wrist-mounted terminal, navigating the maze of failing conduits towards the maintenance sublevel, specifically targeting the main coolant riser for the georegulators, a massive, high-pressure artery running straight through the base's core. Destroying that would unleash lethal superheated steam and massive pressure waves. He needed to be below the creature when it happened. The descent was violent. Thorne kicked out the bolted access panel leading to Corridor 4 Beta, dropping 6 feet onto the cluttered, slick concrete floor of the utility hallway. The impact jarred his knees, but he rolled instantly, weapon drawn, not the knife, but his compact M9 pistol. The air down here was stagnant, thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and scorched wiring. Emergency strobes painted the corridor in frantic bursts of deep crimson and shadow, making every corner look like a potential ambush. He was now approximately 20 meters from the coolant nexus. He moved low, his body language coiled and deadly, navigating through discarded crates and hanging cable bundles. Above him, the structure sighed deeply, a prolonged metal shriek that echoed off the high ceiling. The KY'LAR was tearing down its route of pursuit, ignoring efficiency for raw, brute force speed. He didn't have minutes, he had seconds before the 7.5-foot bioweapon emerged from the ruins of the level above, its golden eyes locked onto his thermal signature. The coolant riser dominated the corridor junction, a massive, insulated pipe, 3 feet in diameter, vibrating audibly as high-pressure fluid coursed through it. Adjacent to it stood the control manifold, a complex series of pressure gauges and heavy valve wheels, scarred by years of maintenance. This was the choke point. Thorne checked his gear again, M9 pistol, 14 rounds, his secondary pistol, unreliable, his knife, and 2 frags. He chose his last M67 fragmentation grenade. He couldn't afford to miss or miscalculate the proximity fuse. Kneeling quickly behind a shattered ventilation unit, he began stripping specialized tripwire components from a discarded signaling flare kit he kept in his vest. The goal wasn't just explosion, it was directional kinetic energy aimed at the weakest point of the manifold housing, ensuring a catastrophic rupture of the pipe itself. The sound of destruction above intensified, the unmistakable, horrible noise of structural columns buckling under overwhelming, unnatural force. A massive, deep crash echoed from the level above, followed by a torrent of concrete dust and broken rebar raining down the vertical shaft nearby. The KY'LAR had skipped the vents entirely, punching straight through the structural ceiling 10 meters away. Thorne flattened himself against the cold metal housing of the control panel, sweat stinging the scarred ridge above his eye. He finished rigging the tripwire, a nearly invisible strand of biopolymer thread stretched low across the only clear path leading directly to the coolant manifold. He set the grenade with a hair-trigger contact fuse, ensuring the slightest disturbance would detonate it before KY'LAR could physically comprehend the threat. He had mere moments. He could hear the creature sliding down the debris pile it had created, the oiled obsidian sheen of its skin barely visible through the thick dust cloud. He pulled his M9 up, sighting down the corridor. He wouldn't shoot to kill, he would shoot to guide, forcing the alien's monstrous bulk precisely into the tripwire's deadly trajectory. The KY'LAR emerged from the fog of concrete dust like a mythological shadow, its elongated, clawed limbs brushing the low ceiling. It was vast and terrifyingly resilient, ignoring the minor wound Thorne had inflicted earlier, a faint black streak across its flank, barely noticeable. Its eyes, Massive pools of bioluminescent gold, fixed immediately on Thorne, who deliberately exposed himself for a brief second before ducking back behind the manifold. The creature took the bait, closing the distance with terrifying speed, its movements less a run and more a blurring, ground-eating stride. It knew the source of the thermal signature was vulnerable and alone. As the KY'LAR's massive leading foot crossed the threshold of the coolant junction, the nearly invisible tripwire tightened. The contact fuse detonated instantly, engulfing the creature's lower body in a deafening, flash-white blast of shrapnel and concussive energy. The scream of tearing metal was immediate and profound, but it wasn't the aliens. The force of the blast, amplified by the confined space, immediately tore a massive fissure in the already stressed coolant manifold. A geyser of superheated, high-pressure steam erupted violently, filling the corridor with a scalding, blinding white cloud and a shriek that ripped through the ears. Thorne slammed his gloved hands over his face and dove low, feeling the heat radiate outwards, searing the air. The explosion had certainly damaged the KY'LAR. He heard a guttural, wet sound unlike anything human, but the primary effect was the catastrophic rupture of the infrastructure. The steam was instantly lethal, a white-hot barrier. Thorne scrambled backward, covering 15 meters in a low crouch, relying solely on muscle memory. He pressed himself against the exterior wall of the corridor, pulling his gas mask down and triggering its internal cooling unit. The KY'LAR was still inside that thermal inferno, but its sheer resilience meant it would emerge, possibly scarred, but definitely enraged. He had gained only a few precious seconds of impenetrable cover. The air in the maintenance sublevel hung thick and heavy, smelling of ozone, stale lubricant, and the metallic tang of liquid nitrogen bleeding slowly from microfractures in the primary coolant system. Thorne was pressed back into a corroded service conduit 20 meters downrange from the massive, ribbed coolant manifold, the lifeblood of the outpost's power core. He felt the vibration through his boots, a rhythmic, heavy tread that was not his own. KY'LAR was moving carefully now, having identified the immediate area as highly critical, though still unaware of the C4 bricks Thorne had precisely taped to the manifold's main valve joint. Connected to 3 highly sensitive acoustic proximity triggers. Thorne lowered the ocular setting on his helmet's HUD, filtering out all but the thermal signature of the alien. The image resolved, a pulsing gold mass moving methodically between the thick, insulated piping. The temperature differentiation was minute but visible. KY'LAR was slightly cooler than the environment, an efficient predator regulating its core temperature. Thorne gripped the 416, taking shallow, ragged breaths. He ignored the aching in his scarred brow and the stiffness in his worn gear. This wasn't a firefight, it was an industrial assassination. He knew the structural tolerances of this facility better than anyone. The blast wouldn't kill KY'LAR instantly, but the resulting rupture, the sheer force of the 5,000 psi liquid coolant escaping its confinement, would turn the maintenance deck into a pressurized kill zone, ensuring the eco-sabotage objective was secondary to survival. KY'LAR's elongated, 3-clawed hand rested momentarily on the manifold's casing, testing the material integrity, a fatal moment of curiosity. A tiny, almost imperceptible red light flickered on the first proximity sensor near the floor. Thorne braced, pressing his spine hard against the cold metal of the conduit wall. The visual feed from the triggers spiked from green to flashing red as KY'LAR's mass registered across all 3 nodes simultaneously. There was a fraction of a second of absolute, terrifying silence, broken by the high-pitched shriek of compressed air escaping a valve. Then, the world inverted. The blast was sharp, localized, and brutally effective. It didn't roar, it snapped dash, delivering a hyperkinetic shockwave that turned the atmosphere into a solid wall. Thorne felt the concussive force punch the air out of his lungs. He heard the metallic groan of the manifold shearing away from the wall anchors, followed immediately by the sound of rushing liquid under immense pressure, a sound akin to 1,000 freight trains simultaneously passing through the maintenance bay. The emergency lighting, already flickering, failed completely, plunging the area into pitch blackness save for the toxic green-blue glow of the escaping coolant, now atomizing into a corrosive, freezing mist. Shrapnel pinged violently off Thorne's helmet and plate carrier. He fought the disorientation, clearing the ringing from his ears as he scrambled forward, already knowing the next sequence of events would be structural collapse. The floor beneath the coolant manifold buckled, tearing open, revealing the foundation below. A low, guttural shriek, undeniably KY'LAR, cut through the rush of the coolant flood. The alien was alive. Thorne saw a massive, distorted shadow moving erratically through the freezing spray 20 feet away, struggling against the sheer physical force of the escaping liquid, which was now carving channels into the concrete floor. He raised the 416 Hong Kong dollars, cycling the bolt, knowing he had maybe 4 seconds before the alien recovered. He fired a 3-round burst at the center mass of the shadow, tracers cutting brilliant lines through the vaporized coolant. The rounds connected, producing strange, low-frequency thuds and a momentary splatter of the obsidian biological material, confirming damage, but not stopping the motion. The alien was retreating, leveraging its long arms to pull itself rapidly out of the most intense flow, disappearing around a support pillar. The outpost was dying. The initial rupture was now a systemic failure. Warning lights flashed crimson across the few remaining digital displays, structural integrity critical. Pressure containment failure. The coolant, far below zero, was reacting violently with the warm air and exposed wiring, creating volatile steam clouds and shorting power relays. Thorne could hear the high-pitched whine of the support struts fatiguing under the sudden asymmetric load. He moved laterally, trying to stay above the fastest rising coolant level, which was now coating the floor in a shimmering, slick sheet of ice and corrosive agents. He saw a brief flash of bioluminescence, KY'LAR's gold eyes, high above him, moving with unnerving speed along the catwalk structure that was peeling away from the main support beams like damp paper. The alien wasn't pursuing him yet, it was escaping the immediate disaster zone it had ironically exacerbated. KY'LAR understood that remaining in this failing chamber meant certain entrapment. Thorne realized the game had changed from ambush to a lethal race against time, where the outpost itself was the primary threat to both combatants. He needed higher ground, where the structural integrity had not yet been fatally compromised. Thorne scrambled toward the massive vertical ventilation shaft he had used for his initial descent. He reached the ladder and began a furious, upward climb, the sound of tearing metal echoing below him. Just as he gained the second landing platform, a deafening crack split the air. The main support pillar near the manifold gave way, causing the entire floor section to drop with a sickening lurch. Dust, ice particles, and heavy steel beams rained down. Thorne flattened himself against the ladder rungs, shielding his head. He looked down and saw KY'LAR, momentarily illuminated by a flash of sparking electrical conduit. The alien was heavily scarred along its left flank where the shrapnel had hit, and its biofiber uniform was visibly shredded, but its movements were still terrifyingly agile. KY'LAR launched itself across the chasm created by the collapse, its long arms grasping a severed cable bundle, swinging itself effortlessly toward Thorne's vertical shaft. It was not retreating anymore, it was closing the gap. Thorne knew he couldn't stop to engage. The 416 Hong Kong dollars was useless against such speed and agility in open, vertical space. The ascent became a frantic, segmented withdrawal. Thorne reached a narrow access hatch leading to the lower barracks level, kicking it open and tumbling through. He was now on level B, slightly more stable but equally compromised, filled with the ghostly white outlines of abandoned equipment and footlockers. The air here was drier, but the pervasive smell of sulfur and superheated metal suggested the structural integrity would not last long. He checked his sidearm, the P226, realizing his primary magazine was nearly depleted and the heavy 416 was cumbersome in the tighter confines of the living quarters. He knew KY'LAR would follow instantly. He reached into his drop pouch and pulled out the last two M67 fragmentation grenades. He needed distance, not destruction, to set up the final scenario. He pulled the pin on the first grenade and lobbed it back through the access hatch into the vertical shaft, counting silently to 4 before detonation. The explosion was muffled, but effective, showering the lower section of the shaft with debris and temporarily disrupting KY'LAR's climb. Thorne used the brief moment of confusion to sprint down the long, deserted corridor, aiming for the central control hub access lift, the only stable choke point left in the entire outpost. KY'LAR burst through the hatch opening moments later, ignoring the persistent ringing in the structure from the flashbang effect of the grenade. The alien's bioluminescent eyes fixed instantly on Thorne's infrared patch, locked onto the retreating target. The previous injury seemed only to fuel its relentless drive. KY'LAR moved low, using the abandoned bunks and gear as cover, covering the distance in impossible strides. Its obsidian body was slick with coolant, catching the failing emergency strobes. Thorne reached the junction leading to the central lift. He spun around, dropping into a kneeling stance, and unleashed the remaining 5.56 rounds from his 416 toward the approaching shadow, aiming for the legs, trying to slow the massive alien down. He managed to force KY'LAR to briefly pause and evade into cover, buying him the precious seconds needed to reach the lift controls. The lift refused to respond, power failure, expected. Thorne cursed, discarding the empty 416, relying solely on his sidearm and the final M67. He was trapped against the lift doors, the only exit being a narrow maintenance vent above the ceiling line. He had reached the end of the line, just as KY'LAR emerged fully from the shadows, poised for the kill, its long arms extended. The detonation had bought Thorne precisely 30 seconds of chaotic cover. He didn't waste a millisecond analyzing the structural failure, he just ran, trusting the schematic stored in his operational memory. The sublevel corridor was a churning river of scalding, corrosive green coolant and pulverized concrete dust. Ahead, the emergency maintenance shaft, a vertical artery designed for swift repair access, now their only path upward, was barely visible through the chemical fog. Thorne vaulted the rail, clipping his carabiner onto the fixed-line cable before plunging into the shaft. He didn't rappel, he used a controlled, desperate slide, the friction heat burning through the leather of his gloves. Below him, the catastrophic groan of the coolant pressure vessels failing signaled the terminal phase of the outpost's existence. A guttural sound, a wet, infuriated shriek, came from the depths. KY'LAR was not only alive, but the heat and chemical burn seemed to have driven the creature into a blind, pain-fueled frenzy. Thorne glanced down and saw the bioluminescent gold eyes reflecting in the noxious steam cloud below, closing the distance impossibly fast, scaling the shaft without the aid of the safety line, relying purely on the purchase of its clawed digits digging into the metal superstructure. Thorne pushed harder, ignoring the pain in his shoulders, the acrid vapor burning his throat, knowing that the structural integrity of the entire sector was now measured in single-digit minutes. The muzzle of the 416 Hong Kong dollars scraped against the concrete wall as he ascended toward the Level 1 access hatch. Thorne slammed through the Level 1 access hatch, the force nearly dislocating his shoulder, and immediately rolled, 416 Hong Kong dollars shouldered and ready. This sector, normally a sterile decontamination bay, was now a nightmare of hanging debris and cascading water pipes. He took 3 steps before realizing the floor was unstable, a thin layer of plating suspended over a newly formed chasm caused by the deep-level failure. He heard the metallic impact behind him as KY'LAR reached the top of the shaft. The creature's movements were jerky, compromised by the coolant burn staining its biofiber uniform and scarring the obsidian skin of its left flank, yet its speed was terrifyingly efficient. Thorne unleashed a short, controlled burst aimed at the chest mass, the tracer rounds momentarily visible in the dust cloud. The impacts drew a thick, black fluid but did not stop the creature's forward momentum. KY'LAR lunged, its disproportionately long arms sweeping out, tearing a deep gouge into the structural support column next to Thorne. The entire floor shuddered. Thorne dropped his center of gravity, leveraging the unstable environment. He sidestepped the second, slower sweep, using the recoil of the rifle to pivot and deliver a vicious buttstock strike to the side of the alien's streamlined head. The blow was bone-jarringly solid and KY'LAR stumbled, its gold eyes flickering violently. That hesitation, a quarter-second lapse induced by internal concussion, was the only break Thorne needed. The main path to the surface airlock was rendered impassable by a massive pressure wave that had vaporized the blast doors. Thorne rerouted instantly, sprinting down an older, rarely used corridor leading to the auxiliary vehicle garage. The air here was colder, hinting at the thin barrier separating them from the exterior environment. He could taste the difference: less chemical burn, more desert dust and ozone. The concrete underfoot began to crumble into fine powder with every stride, indicating the ground integrity was failing. KY'LAR, recognizing the direction of escape, maintained a dogged pace, a dark blur of biological determination. The distance between them shrank as Thorne's combat fatigue caught up with him. Every breath was shallow, every muscle screamed in protest. He reached the heavy, rusted auxiliary door, kicking the emergency release bar. The door groaned, refusing to open fully, binding on a distorted hinge. Thorne emptied the remaining rounds from his primary magazine into the lock mechanism, shattering the heavy solenoid. He shoved the 416 Hong Kong dollars aside, grabbing the handle and pulling with desperate, raw strength. As the gap widened enough to squeeze through, the chilling sound of KY'LAR's claws skittering on the concrete behind him intensified. He slid under the partially open door and spun, drawing his secondary weapon, a compact SIG P226, just as the colossal figure slammed against the metal barrier. The auxiliary garage was a frozen, cavernous space where the temperature differential had caused a thick, localized fog. Beyond the heavy blast doors of the garage lay the final surface access hatch, requiring a complex manual crank sequence to open. Thorne slammed his weight against the auxiliary door, holding it shut while KY'LAR hammered relentlessly from the other side, the heavy steel plating warping inward like foil. He knew the secondary weapon wouldn't stop the creature, only momentarily slow it. He abandoned the door, sprinting toward the circular hatch, ripping the manual deployment key from its recessed housing. He inserted the key and began the agonizingly slow process of turning the mechanism. Crack dash. The auxiliary door finally burst inward, the resulting debris cloud shrouding KY'LAR for a second. Thorne spun the wheel with maniacal speed, his knuckles white against the metal. The hinges screamed in protest. KY'LAR emerged from the dust, its arms spread wide, closing the final meters not in a run, but a controlled, predatory glide. Thorne stopped cranking just as the hatch seal broke and the exterior wind shrieked into the garage. He didn't have time to complete the sequence. He fired the P226, aiming for the gold eyes, emptying the entire magazine. The impact momentarily confused the alien, buying him the necessary second to pull the heavily weighted pry bar from the wall bracket beside the hatch. KY'LAR absorbed the pistol rounds without slowing, its focus singular, terminating the threat. It moved past the ineffective fire, its three clawed digits reaching for Thorne's throat. Thorne ducked the grab, the biofiber uniform brushing his helmet, and used the full momentum of his body to swing the heavy pry bar in a massive, horizontal arc. The blow struck KY'LAR across the knee joint, the point of maximum leverage and structural weakness in a bipedal form. A sickening, wet crack echoed in the cold garage, and the 7.5-foot figure dropped instantly, its leg grotesquely twisted. KY'LAR roared, not a human sound, but a tearing, high-frequency sound of pure biological distress, its long arms scrambling to pull itself forward while dragging the shattered limb. Thorne didn't hesitate, this was the last viable window. He dropped the pry bar, retrieved the P226, and despite the empty magazine, smashed the butt of the weapon down repeatedly onto the compromised knee joint, ensuring the structural failure was complete and irrevocable. He then leveraged his combat knife, driving the razor-sharp ceramic blade deep into the creature's streamlined neck where the obsidian skin met the biofiber collar. The bioluminescent gold eyes dimmed instantly, the massive frame going rigid before collapsing into stillness, the black blood pooling quickly on the dusty concrete floor. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the shriek of the wind rushing in through the partially opened hatch, a sound that signaled both escape and a violent ending. Thorne didn't look back at the carcass of the alien. He returned to the hatch, throwing the final rotation of the manual crank. The heavy circular door swung open, revealing the pre-dawn desert landscape, wind-whipped and stark against the bruised orange sky. He hauled himself through the opening, collapsing onto the frozen, cratered ground outside the reinforced bunker entrance. The air was frigid, instantly chilling the sweat and chemical residue on his gear. Behind him, inside the outpost structure, the noises of collapsing steel and imploding pressure walls reached a terrifying crescendo. The ground vibrated violently under his chest. He turned his head and saw the ground where the main outpost structure had stood moments before begin to visibly sink, buckling inward as the terminal structural failure reached the surface. Corrosive steam erupted from every fissure, the green chemical cloud boiling hundreds of feet into the cold atmosphere. Thorne pushed himself forward, crawling away from the perimeter, away from the archive and the evidence of the catastrophic encounter, towards a distant, shimmering heat signature visible on the horizon, the extraction point. The archives were sealed, buried under 100,000 tons of steel and rock, the final testament to an encounter no one on Earth would ever fully comprehend. He crawled until the rhythmic pulse of the rescue beacon was the only sound left in the world.